The sharp, distinct sound of splintering timber cut through the ambient noise of the Pacific surf outside my window. I froze, the cardboard moving box heavy in my hands. Dust drifted down from the ceiling of my new living room, catching the late afternoon sunlight in a hazy, suspended cloud. As a structural engineer, I didn't just hear sounds, I diagnosed them. I spent my days calculating load paths and stress tolerances for commercial bridges. That sound above me wasn't the harmless creak of an old house settling into its foundation. That was the acoustic signature of a load-bearing joist failing under extreme tensile stress. I dropped the box of engineering textbooks. The heavy cardboard hit the bare hardwood floors with a dull thud, but my attention was already locked on the exact center of the ceiling. The vintage plaster was bowing inward, a jagged hairline fracture spidering outward like frost on a windshield. Moving to the sunny California coast exactly 48 hours ago was supposed to be my escape from the endless, soul-numbing rotation of temporary corporate housing. I wanted a permanent anchor. Now, it looked like my ceiling was about to cave in and crush my sparse furniture. If that beam gave way, my unit would be condemned along with the rest of the building, and my deposit was already cashed. This wasn't charity, it was self-preservation, with a blueprint attached. I didn't waste time waiting to see if the fracture would hold. Snatching my heavy-duty flashlight and digital laser measure from the open canvas toolkit on the kitchen counter, I took the stairs 2 at a time to the unit above mine. The sound of my work boots rang urgent and sharp on the worn wooden treads. The door to the upper unit was wide open, propped by a heavy ceramic planter. Stepping inside without knocking, I swept the beam of my flashlight across the floorboards. The space was a massive, airy artist studio, smelling strongly of linseed oil, mineral spirits, and the sharp tang of the salt breeze. Massive canvases leaned against the walls, but my focus locked immediately on the center of the room. The floor dipped noticeably, forming a shallow, structural basin waiting to collapse into the void below. Ilani Chavez stood at the absolute edge of the depression. Her hands gripped the back of a paint-splattered wooden chair so hard her knuckles were bone white. Her dark hair was tied up in a messy knot, a pencil stuck through it, and her expression was a tight mask of exhaustion and rising panic. She was 36, the owner of this triplex, and the woman who had handed me the keys with a weary, polite smile just 2 days ago. "Don't step there," she said, her voice steady but thin, stretched to its absolute limit. I stayed exactly where I was, kneeling at the perimeter, where the floor met the wall. I pressed the base of my laser measure against the original baseboard. I fired the red dot straight across the room, hitting the opposite wall, and let the device calculate the deflection angle. 2.4 inches of drop. Critical failure was no longer a possibility. It was imminent. "Your primary crossbeam just snapped," I stated, keeping my tone entirely flat and objective. Panic was a useless variable in a structural equation. "I need access to the basement crawlspace, right now. Where is the exterior hatch?" She didn't argue or ask if I was sure. Reaching into the oversized pocket of her denim apron, she tossed me a heavy ring of brass keys. They clattered against the floorboards near my boots. The air in the crawlspace was thick with damp earth, salt, and decades of undisturbed dust. Navigating the low, 30-inch clearance on my hands and knees, I let the beam of my flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating ancient plumbing runs and heavy cobwebs. The problem revealed itself immediately. The main support beam, a massive old-growth timber that had likely been carrying this house since the 1950s, had split laterally along a hidden rot line. It wasn't just age and coastal moisture at fault. Someone had improperly notched the wood decades ago to run a modern HVAC duct, completely compromising the load-bearing integrity. Pulling off my right work glove, I pressed my bare hand against the raw, jagged edge of the break. The wood groaned above me, a deep, physical vibration traveling through the entire floor system and into my palm. Mentally calculating the dead load above the heavy antique furniture, the appliances, the cast iron bathtub, combined with the live weight of the occupants, the math was grim. We had maybe a few hours before the deflection caused a complete sheer tear. Shielding my phone screen from the falling dirt, I dialed my colleague, Liam Patel, from my chest pocket. "Liam," I said the second the line connected, "I need 2 12-ton hydraulic bottle jacks, 4 steel shoring posts, and a stack of half-inch steel distribution plates delivered to my new address. Emergency rush. Put it on my personal corporate card. You haven't even unpacked your coffee maker, Miles." Liam's voice crackled back, filled with confusion over the noise of the firm's drafting room. "What are you shoring?" The ceiling above my bed? I replied dryly. I'll brew it over the rubble if I have to. Just get the steel here. I hung up before he could ask another question. Crawling backward out of the darkness, I pushed the heavy wooden hatch open and stood up in the narrow side yard. Brushing the damp dirt from the knees of my jeans, I found Ilani pacing the concrete walkway. She stopped, her arms crossed tight over her chest, shivering slightly in the coastal breeze despite the afternoon sun. How bad is it? She asked, dropping her arms to her sides. I gave her the hard truth, refusing to soften facts when safety was on the line. Bad enough that if you walk across the center of your studio, you and your easel will end up in my living room. Letting out a harsh breath, she leaned back against the weathered cedar siding of the house. She closed her eyes for a second, the muscles in her jaw jumping. I can't afford a structural contractor to replace a main beam this week, Miles. I just can't. The city permits a loan. Watching the tension radiating from her, I didn't offer a hollow platitude. I'm a licensed structural engineer, I said, wiping the grit from my hands with a shop rag from my back pocket. I don't need a contractor to diagnose this. I know exactly how to fix it. She studied my face, her eyes narrowing slightly against the sun, looking for an angle. Then, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded, aggressive-looking legal letter printed on heavy stock paper. My landlady said the rent could wait, she muttered, quoting our brief conversation from Tuesday when I handed her my deposit check and noticed her stressed demeanor. Then she asked what I could offer instead. She handed me the document. Unfolding it, I read a formal notice of intent to purchase the property, backed by the thinly veiled threat of reporting existing, grandfathered code violations to the City Planning Commission. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dean Baker. I knew the name from city planning meetings. He was a corporate developer notoriously known for buying up vulnerable coastal properties, bleeding the owners dry with legal fees, and bulldozing the history to build luxury glass condos. And Dean Baker's threat touched the exact systems I dealt with every day: permits, liability, structural integrity. He had stepped into my professional language. I don't need rent right now, Ilani said, her voice dropping into a quiet, fierce register that demanded respect. I need this building to survive. It's my grandfather's. It's the only thing I have left. Reading the precise, bloodless corporate language, I folded the letter with sharp creases and handed it back to her. You can say no, and I'll still send you the written hazard report tonight so you can hire a crew, I told her, making sure my tone was entirely neutral. But if you want a faster path, I'll help you stabilize it. This is your property and your call. I'm offering engineering, not ownership. You buy the steel. I provide the labor, the tools, and the professional stamp. She exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The defensive tension left her shoulders in a rush, replaced by a grounded determination. Order the steel, she said. Turning back toward the crawl space, my mind was already running the geometric math to stabilize the load. The heavy materials arrived on a flatbed truck 3 hours later, the diesel engine idling loudly in the quiet coastal neighborhood. Ilani and I stood in the driveway, watching the driver unstrap the load and lower the heavy shoring post onto the concrete with a loud clang. Moving forward immediately to grab one of the heavy steel distribution plates, she was stopped when I stepped smoothly in front of her, blocking her path. I've got the heavy lifting, I said, shifting into the clipped command tone I automatically used on active job sites. She stopped, bristling instantly. Her dark eyes flashed. It's my house, Miles. I'm not standing around on the sidewalk while you do all the work in the dirt. Facing her fully, I saw her chin lifted, her defensive walls fully raised again. She was a woman used to fighting for every inch of her territory, entirely unaccustomed to anyone stepping between her and a problem. I didn't say you couldn't work, I corrected, keeping my voice perfectly level to strip any condescension from the air. I said, I'm carrying the steel plates. They are 80 pounds each, and I know how to carry them in a low-clearance crawl space without throwing out a lumbar disc. I need you to grab the hydraulic jacks and the heavy flashlights. Testing the boundary for a long second, she calculated if I was trying to sideline her or just being practical. Seeing I was entirely serious about the logistics, she nodded once, picked up the 2 heavy red jacks without another word, and followed me to the hatch. We spent the next 4 hours in the cramped, humid air of the basement. The space was barely tall enough to sit up in. Positioning the heavy bottle jacks directly under the failing joist, I laid the thick plates of steel into the dirt to distribute the massive weight over a wider surface area so the jacks wouldn't just sink into the earth. Sweat stung my eyes, mixing with the pervasive dust. Pump the left handle, I instructed her over the sound of our breathing. Leaning her weight into the heavy iron bar, she forced the mechanism downward. The hydraulic cylinder hissed, rising slowly, making contact with the wood. I kept my flashlight beam locked on the pressure gauge, listening intently to the acoustic feedback of the old timber. "Hold," I commanded sharply. Stopping instantly, she froze her motion. The terrible, tearing groans from the floorboards above ceased. The structure was stabilized, the weight successfully transferred to the temporary steel columns. Sitting back in the dirt, we breathed hard. The smell of oxidized iron and damp soil was thick in the air. The silence in the basement felt less like a threat and more like a truce. Looking over at her, I saw her face smudged with dirt, a streak of grease across her cheekbone. She looked steady. She hadn't panicked once in the dark. We had successfully bought ourselves time. The next morning, the thick coastal fog rolled in, dropping the temperature and blanketing the neighborhood in a cold, gray mist. Waking up at 5 a.m., my shoulders and back were stiff from maneuvering the steel. I made a pot of black coffee in my makeshift kitchen, stepping over boxes I still hadn't unpacked, then walked out to the shared front porch. The old wooden porch railing was loose. I had noticed it on move-in day. It wobbled dangerously when I leaned my hip against it to look out at the surf. Setting my mug down on the windowsill, I didn't go inside to ask Alani for a work order. I walked to my truck, unlocked the side toolbox, grabbed my heavy-duty impact drill and a handful of 4-inch galvanized lag screws. It took exactly 20 minutes to mechanically secure the main posts to the deck fascia. My brain was wired for structural integrity. It drove me crazy knowing it was unsafe, especially with the slick, wet fog coating the wood. When the drill fell silent, I turned around to find Alani standing in the doorway. Wrapped in a thick, oversized wool sweater, she held a battered green thermos of coffee. Staring at the freshly secured railing, she then looked at the drill in my hand. "I didn't ask you to fix that," she said, her voice guarded. Putting the drill back in my canvas bag, I didn't apologize. "I know you didn't, but it was a sheer hazard. If someone leaned back, the lateral force would have snapped the rusted nails. Now, it's not a hazard. It's just a railing." Expecting her to argue, to protect her fierce independence, I waited for the pushback. But she didn't. Walking over, she placed her hand firmly on the top rail and pushed. It didn't budge a millimeter. She looked out at the fog, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said quietly. Unscrewing the top of her thermos, she poured a second cup of steaming coffee into the lid and set it on the newly secured porch railing right next to me. The steam rose rapidly into the freezing gray morning air. I wrapped both hands around the thermos lid she had set beside me and stopped scanning the porch for the next thing that could break. We stood side by side, a foot of space between us, watching the fog drift slowly over the Pacific. We didn't talk about Dean Baker. We didn't talk about the broken beam holding up her life. We just shared the quiet, the sound of the ocean, and the bitter taste of black coffee. By the end of the first week, our days found a rhythm. During daylight hours, I managed bridge spans from my cubicle in the financial district, slipping Alani's structural framing plans onto my secondary monitor whenever Liam Patel wasn't dropping laminated change orders on my desk. But it was the evenings that grounded me. On Thursday night, the temperature inside the triplex was freezing due to the coastal wind howling outside. We were sitting at my kitchen island, currently buried under wide rolls of blueprints I had printed at the office. Calculating the necessary load limits, my mechanical pencil scratched steadily across a yellow legal pad. Alani sat across from me, reviewing a fresh, terrifyingly high quote from the local steel fabricator. She rubbed her left temple. I was quickly learning that small, unconscious gesture meant she was reaching her breaking point. Sliding the quote across the marble island toward me, she sighed. $3,000 for the custom flange, she said, her voice hollow, stripped of its usual fire. "I don't have it, Miles. The property taxes drained the emergency account last month. I can't buy the steel. I didn't offer empty reassurance." Pulling the quote toward me, my eyes scanned the material costs before I reached for my scientific calculator. I spent 3 silent minutes punching in deflection tolerances, yield strengths, and load capacities. If we switch from a heavy W8x15 beam to a shape standard profile, and I weld a 1/4-inch top plate myself on site, I said, writing the new variables rapidly on the legal pad, we still meet the 40% overcode safety factor. And we dropped the fabrication cost by $800, turning the pad so she could see the final, lower number circled in graphite. I waited. She stared at the paper. Her shoulders physically dropped, the visible, crushing weight lifting from her frame. Her breathing slowed, returning to a normal rhythm. Looking from the paper to me, a quiet amazement settled in her eyes. "Dean sent another notice today, too," she added quietly, her voice steadier now. Sliding a second piece of paper across the island, she pointed to a highlighted section. "He claims the exterior stucco is a public safety hazard. But look at the date code. He cited a municipal ordinance that was repealed 2 years ago. He's just throwing paperwork at the wall to see what makes me panic." Stopping my writing, I picked up the paper, scanning the dense legal threats. Dean was methodical, cold, and calculated, but he was getting sloppy in his rush to exhaust her. I reached across the paper, making sure not to touch her hand, but tapping the blunt tip of my pencil firmly against Dean's signature. "He's relying on intimidation," I said, my voice projecting absolute, unshakable calm. "He wants you to flinch, but intimidation doesn't hold up against a stamped engineering report. I'm going to certify the exterior myself tomorrow morning, and I'll cite the correct, current ordinance. We kill the leverage with facts." Exhaling, she leaned back in her chair. The tension in the room shifted entirely, the cold panic replaced by a quiet, shared resolve. We went back to work, the silence between us comfortable and productive. On Saturday, the coastal weather turned brutal. The wind whipped violently off the ocean, carrying a freezing mist that bit straight through the thin cotton fabric of my work shirt. We were in the side yard, measuring the exterior stucco walls to draft the certification report I promised. Holding the dumb end of the fiberglass tape measure against the corner of the foundation, her hands were bright red from the cold. She shivered violently, trying to hide it by rolling her shoulders and staring intensely at the numbers. Stopping my pull on the tape, I dropped my end. Walking over to my truck, I unlocked the cab and pulled out my heavy, fleece-lined canvas work jacket. I walked back to her and held it out. "Put this on," I said. Shaking her head stubbornly, she refused. "I'm fine, Miles. It's just wind. Let's just finish the elevation." I didn't pull the jacket back, nor did I argue. Standing there, my stance immovable, I held the heavy coat between us. "You're losing manual dexterity in your fingers," I stated objectively. "If you can't hold the tape tight against the masonry, the measurements are useless. Put the jacket on, Alani." A sharp flash of defiance crossed her dark eyes. She hated being told what to do, hated appearing weak. But the wind hit her again, a vicious gust off the water, and she finally relented. Dropping the tape, she slipped her arms into the heavy sleeves. The jacket was huge on her. It swallowed her frame, smelling faintly of sawdust and ozone. Pulling the thick corduroy collar up around her neck, she buried her chin in it. "Fine," she muttered, looking away toward the churning ocean. "But only because I need my fingers to hold the tape." Keeping my face neutral, a tight, anxious knot in my chest suddenly loosened. When we went inside to the warmth of her studio, she tried to shrug out of the coat to hand it back to me. Pointing a gloved finger to the brass coat hook by her front door, I didn't take it. "Leave it there," I said, already turning toward the stairs. "You might need it tomorrow." Walking down to my unit, I didn't give her a chance to formulate a protest. The real trouble started on Tuesday, 4 days before the scheduled city inspection. Finalizing the exact CAD models for the steel at the firm, my cell phone rang. Seeing Alani's name, I answered immediately. "They're here," she said, her voice tight, vibrating with genuine panic. "The city inspector. Dean is with him. They moved the date up without telling me. They're demanding to see the basement." Standing up so fast my heavy office chair rolled backward and slammed into the cubicle wall, I grabbed my truck keys. "Do not let them into the basement," I commanded, my voice dropping into a hard, professional cadence that left no room for negotiation. "The shoring is safe, but it's temporary. It doesn't meet permanent code. If they see it before the permanent steel beam is installed, they will red tag the whole building. You won't be allowed to sleep there tonight." Sprinting for the elevator, I added, "I'm 10 minutes away. Delay them. Ask to see their credentials. Make them wait." Driving the winding coastal highway with white knuckles gripping the leather steering wheel, I rapidly calculated the legal limits of a surprise municipal inspection. Pulling into the driveway, the tires crunching loudly on the gravel, I saw Dean Baker standing on the front porch. He was a smug, tailored presence in an expensive suit, standing next to a city inspector holding a clipboard. Alani stood in the doorway, physically blocking their entry with her body. She held her ground, but her shoulders were rigid with stress. Cutting across the damp lawn, taking the porch steps in one stride, I stepped directly between Alani and the two men. I didn't look at Alani. I locked eyes with the inspector. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting calm, undeniable authority. "I'm the structural engineer of record for this property. This is a private residence, and you are outside your legally scheduled inspection window." Scoffing, Dean stepped forward, trying to use his height to intimidate. "We received an anonymous tip regarding catastrophic structural failure, Mr. Phillips. The city has a fundamental right to investigate immediate life safety hazards. Move aside." Refusing to back down an inch, I pulled my firm ID and my hard plastic state licensure card from my wallet, holding them out directly in front of the inspector's face. "There is no immediate life safety hazard," I stated, my tone leaving zero room for debate. "The structure is currently shored far beyond safety requirements under my direct, licensed supervision." Looking the inspector dead in the eye, I read his sudden hesitation. He knew the parameters of his job. "Absent an emergency order or a court-issued warrant, you do not have consent to enter this residence today," I continued, my voice low and lethal. "If you cross that threshold, I will have my firm's legal department file an injunction against the city for harassment and unlawful entry by close of business. Do you want your name on that lawsuit?" The inspector looked at Dean, his expression souring, then back at my license. Clicking his pen, he clearly wanted no part of a brutal legal battle with a corporate engineering firm over a residential triplex. "Fine," the inspector said, stepping back off the porch. "We'll be back on the 24th at 9 a.m. sharp, and the repair better be perfect." Turning around, they walked back to their pristine city vehicle. Standing completely still, I watched until their taillights disappeared down the street. Only then did I turn to Alani. Leaning heavily against the doorframe, her hands were shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to pull her against my chest and promise her that Dean would never set foot on this property again. Shoving my hands deep into my pockets, I forced myself to maintain a professional distance. "I handled it," I said quietly. That night, the atmosphere in the building fundamentally changed. The immediate, terrifying threat of a red tag eviction was gone, but the reality of the impending deadline loomed over us like a guillotine. The heavy steel beam had to be installed before the 24th, or my delay tactics wouldn't matter. Calling it 6 p.m., the steel fabricator delivered bad news. The custom S-beam was ready, but it was sitting in an industrial warehouse 30 miles away, and their delivery truck was broken down. They couldn't deliver it until next Monday. That was too late. Hanging up the phone, I looked at Alani across the kitchen island. "We have to go get it ourselves," I said. Renting a heavy-duty flatbed trailer from a local hardware store, we drove through the dark, winding coastal mountains to the industrial park. The warehouse was massive and freezing. Loading the heavy piece of flanged steel using a loud, yellow gantry crane required precise communication. By the time we secured the massive load to the trailer with heavy nylon ratchet straps, tightening them until they hummed like guitar strings, it was nearly midnight. Sitting on the lowered tailgate of my truck for a minute to catch our breath before the long drive back, the industrial park was completely silent. Pale yellow security lights buzzed faintly overhead. Alani traced the rim of the cheap paper coffee cup we had picked up at a gas station. "My grandfather built that triplex with his own hands," she said suddenly, her voice stripped of its usual armor, sounding incredibly vulnerable in the massive, empty parking lot. "He didn't have an engineering degree, just grit, a hammer, and time. If Dean forces a sale and demolishes it, it's like erasing his fingerprint from the coast." "I feel like I'm failing him, Miles." Listening to the raw honesty in her tone, I understood it perfectly. It wasn't just property to her. It was a physical connection to her bloodline. It was her sanctuary. Keeping my hands firmly planted on the cold, ribbed metal of the tailgate, I knew restraint was harder than action. I didn't offer a preachy speech about family memories living in the heart. I offered a concrete fact. Timber rots, Alani. It's a physical property of the material over time, subjected to moisture and gravity. It is not a reflection of your character, and it is not a failure of your stewardship. Pulling my small, waterproof field notebook from my chest pocket, I clicked my pen and wrote down the dates in sharp block letters. The 18th for the failed ambush, The 24th for the real inspection? I underlined the final date twice, the pen biting into the paper. We aren't letting it fall, I said simply. We have a schedule, we have the steel, and we are going to meet the deadline. Tearing the page out, I handed it to her. It wasn't a love letter, it was a commitment. The installation that weekend was brutal, bone-aching work. Spending Saturday and Sunday trapped in the dirt crawl space, I brought in Liam from my firm, bribing him with expensive beer to help with the heavy lifting. Using the hydraulic bottle jacks to lift the massive steel beam inch by excruciating inch, we maneuvered it blindly into place beside the cracked, groaning wooden joist. The air was thick with the smell of metal shavings, ozone, and sweat. Handling the heavy torque wrench, my muscles burned as I drove half-inch lag bolts through the steel flange and deep into the old-growth timber, sistering them together permanently. Ilani ran the laser level on the floor above, calling out the deflection numbers through a walkie-talkie as the floor slowly flattened back to zero. Hold, her voice crackled through the radio, echoing in the dirt basement. We are dead level. 0.0 deflection. Stopping my ratcheting action, I dropped the heavy wrench onto the dirt floor. My forearms trembled slightly from the strain. Looking at the structural joint under the beam of my flashlight, it was beautiful. The heavy steel carried the load effortlessly, bypassing the damaged wood entirely. The building was safe. It would stand for another 100 years. Clapping me on the shoulder, exhausted and covered in dirt, Liam headed upstairs to wash up. Staying in the dirt for a minute, I methodically packed away my heavy tools into their canvas bags. Crawling over the dirt to my side of the beam, Ilani shined her flashlight on the heavy steel. Tracing the line of bolts with the light, she then looked at me. You did it, she whispered. Shaking my head, I closed the metal latch on my toolbox with a sharp click. We did it. The math doesn't work without the right team. The victory, however, was incredibly short-lived. On Monday morning, the 23rd, the day before the final inspection, a certified letter arrived in Ilani's mailbox. Drinking coffee on the porch when she opened it, I watched the color rapidly drain from her face. She handed the heavy paper to me, without a word. It was a formal notice from the Coastal Zoning Board. Dean Baker had bypassed the local building inspector entirely. Hiring a lawyer, he petitioned the board to revoke Ilani's multifamily occupancy permit, claiming that the structural modifications we just finished constituted an unpermitted major redevelopment that violated current coastal zoning laws. The emergency hearing was scheduled for Tuesday evening, the exact time the building inspector was supposed to arrive at the house. It's a trap, I said, reading the dense legal text, my eyes scanning the clauses. If you go to the hearing downtown to defend yourself, the inspector shows up here, finds nobody home, and fails the structural inspection by default. If you stay here for the inspector, the board revokes your permit by default because you didn't show up to object. Sitting down heavily on the top porch step, Ilani stared blankly out at the ocean. He won, she said quietly, her voice devoid of hope. He found a loophole. I can't be in two places at once, Miles. It's over. Looking at the letter, my jaw tightened until my teeth ached. A cold, calculated anger settled deep into my chest. Dean wanted to play the system. He wanted to use bureaucracy to crush her. I built systems for a living. Folding the letter neatly, I put it in my pocket. You stay here, I commanded. You walk the inspector through the property. Show him the steel. Show him the zero deflection on the laser. Looking up at me, she was utterly confused. What about the board hearing? They'll rule against me. Picking up my coffee mug, I mapped out the logistics. I'm going to the board hearing. I'm not your lawyer, but this petition hinges entirely on whether this was an illegal redevelopment or an emergency stabilization. That part is my domain. Tuesday evening at City Hall was a crowded, brightly lit, intimidating affair. The zoning board sat on a raised mahogany dais, looking bored and bureaucratic. Standing at the podium in a tailored suit, Dean Baker presented his case with polished, practiced ease. He spoke eloquently about neighborhood safety, declining property values, and the profound dangers of unpermitted major redevelopment by negligent amateur landlords. He painted Ilani as a hazard to the community. Sitting in the back row, my heavy canvas blueprint tube resting across my knees, I waited patiently for him to finish. When the board chairman finally banged his gavel and asked if there was anyone to speak on behalf of the property owner, I stood up. I didn't wear a suit. Wearing my heavy canvas work jacket and my scuffed leather work boots, I brought the reality of the job site directly into their pristine, carpeted room. Walking down the center aisle to the podium, I set my heavy tube down with a loud, echoing thud. I'm Miles Phillips, licensed structural engineer, and I'm here on the structural question, I stated, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. Looking at me, Dean's polished smile faltered slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his eyes. Unrolling my blueprints across the podium, I weighted the corners with my hands. I didn't give a passionate, emotional speech about Alani's grandfather or the tragedy of losing an art studio. I gave them measurable, unarguable reality. Mr. Baker claims this repair constitutes a major redevelopment, I said, looking directly at the board chairman. That is factually and legally incorrect under Section 4B of the Coastal Zoning Code. I have here the stamped, certified engineering schematics of the repair. Holding up the heavy paper, the bright blue ink of my professional state seal was clearly visible to the room. We did not alter the footprint. We did not increase the load capacity. We executed a localized sistering of a failing joist to restore the original structural integrity of the home. Furthermore, I turned my head to look directly at Dean. The repair utilizes an shape standard steel flange that exceeds current seismic code requirements by 40% and restores the structure to full compliant integrity. The room went completely quiet. The board members leaned forward, adjusting their glasses, looking at the stamped schematics. Stepping forward, Dean's face flushed with anger. They didn't pull a major redevelopment permit, he argued loudly. The work is illegal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Pulling a secondary, tri-folded document from my pocket, I slid it smoothly across the table to the chairman. We didn't need one. Under the city's emergency stabilization clause, a licensed engineer can execute immediate life safety repairs to prevent collapse and file the secondary retro permit paperwork within 30 days, which I filed this morning at 8 a.m. Reviewing the receipt, checking the timestamp, the chairman looked at Dean with evident annoyance. The engineer is correct, Mr. Baker. The property is fully in compliance with city codes. The petition to revoke occupancy is denied. Case closed. He banged the gavel. Rolling up my blueprints, I didn't look at Dean. I didn't gloat. Walking out of the room, my phone was already dialing Alani. How did it go? She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with anxiety. I heard her let out a long, shaky, incredible breath on the other end of the line. The inspector just left, she said, her voice catching slightly. He signed off on the steel. I told him my partner runs the cleanest retrofits in the county, and he actually agreed. I stood still on the concrete steps of City Hall with the phone pressed to my ear, the cold air cutting through my canvas jacket, and stopped correcting people in my head about what this was. She had already named it. We had beaten the system. We had protected the sanctuary. I'm coming home, I said, and ended the call. Pulling into the driveway 20 minutes later, the coastal fog had completely cleared, leaving the night sky sharp and bright with stars. Alani was waiting for me on the front porch. The new lag screws I had installed held the railing perfectly still as she leaned heavily against it. She wasn't wearing my oversized work jacket. She was wearing her own sweater, looking strong, capable, and entirely grounded in her own space. Walking up the concrete steps, the heavy blueprint tube slung casually over my shoulder, we didn't celebrate with a grand, cinematic speech. We just stood there in the quiet aftermath of the victory, the sheer exhaustion finally catching up with us. The ocean crashed rhythmically against the rocks in the distance. Reaching into the deep pocket of her sweater, Alani pulled out a heavy brass keyring. It wasn't the single, standard key to my lower unit that she had given me weeks ago. It was the master set the heavy keys to the basement hatch, the electrical boxes, the roof access, and her own studio door. She held them out to me. My landlady said the rent could wait, she said softly, perfectly echoing the words from the letter that had started all of this. But she doesn't want rent anymore. Looking at the heavy brass keys resting in her palm, I understood the immense weight of the gesture. She fiercely protected her independence. She wasn't asking me to be her tenant. She wasn't asking me to be her handyman. She was making a conscious, deliberate choice. I didn't hesitate. Reaching out, I took the keys. Our hands met over the heavy brass, steady and practical in the cold night air. I closed my fingers firmly around the metal. I'll take the job, I said. The lease downstairs would technically stay in my name, but the heavy brass master set meant I wasn't just living below her anymore. I was building with her now. I slid the master keys into my pocket beside my own house key and heard the metal settle together with one clean, final weight. For once, I wasn't thinking about the next address. We had a final inspection certificate to file at the city planning office tomorrow, and after that, she needed help clearing the construction dust out of her studio so she could finally paint again. The end. Closing thoughts. I learned that you don't build trust by taking control away from someone. You build it by proving you can stand strong beside them when the weight gets heavy. Real love isn't about rescuing someone from their life. It's about giving them the tools and the safety to build it together. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.